Aloha, everyone. Good evening. So just wanted to thank everybody so much for joining us this evening. Very excited to share my very dear friend and colleague, Adam Levine, with you, Dr. Adam Levine, this evening. Adam has an incredible mind. It's going to be on full display in this talk, I'm sure. And he has an impressive background. Currently, he is the Edward Drummond and Florence Scott Libby Director of the Toledo Museum of Art, where he has been director since 2020. Prior to that, he was the director of the Cummer Museum in Florida. And once upon a time, we were both Andrew W. Mellon Fellows together at the Toledo Museum of Art. So that was how we originally met and began our long professional association. Adam went to Dartmouth. He majored impressively in anthropology, art history, and mathematics because he was looking for a challenge. And he was a Rhodes Scholar studying and completing his PhD at Oxford. He is just an incredible human being. He is an incredible gift to our field. He constantly asks questions and explores issues and pushes boundaries where others don't want to look. So I'm very, very excited to have Adam with us this evening, and please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Hopefully, there we go, and it's on. You can all hear me, right? I was joking before that I never understand people who don't know if the amplification isn't working. It's very clear to me, right? So I'm glad that you can all hear me. Helena, thank you so much for the kind welcome. It is a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. Helena is not just a dear colleague, but she's a dear, dear friend, and I can't tell you, yes?
I don't hear amplification if you have any.
So if you want to turn the volume up, there we go. I see Zach working on it in the back. Can I get a thumbs up? Is that better? Yeah. Great. All right. I will also enunciate really, really clearly. But I just want to, that was just the punchline when I was going to say you're so fortunate to have Helena Norton Westbrook running your institution. So I have this background that is part technology, right, and part art history. None of that qualifies me to talk to you about this topic, but I will do my best. I've been told I have 40 minutes. I take direction well, but in 40 minutes, this is a big topic to cover. So what I've decided I'm going to do is try and orient us around what's happened with museums in the past, sort of the general cycle with which museums have engaged technology. Then we'll talk a little bit about where we are today and actually some of the perniciousness about how technology has introduced itself into sort of museum operations. And then gesture towards what I think is a more hopeful future, although it's going to require you to bear with me because I'm going to have to ask you to throw out the headlines you've read over the past sort of 6 months about certain technologies and view them as opportunities and as tools, rather than as Ponzi schemes that have not been executed particularly well. But we will get there, and I promise you as a millennial, the future is bright. So, before we start talking about museums in times of rapid technological change, I think it's important for us to orient around some definitions, right? Because words are unstable, and it's important that we all are on the same page as we march through this presentation. So I'm sure you all thought we would start with Aristotle. I am a Greek and Roman art historian. That's my background, so I kind of had to. Aristotle is not the first person to write about the Greek concept of techne. Xenophon was responding to Socrates, and then Plato and Aristotle, both commented on it as well. But I think it's actually important to actually level set on what we mean by technology, right? Because technology actually has absolutely nothing to do with the smartphone in your pocket, right? Technology is ology, logia, right? Study of, right? But it is actually about the systematic approach to creating something with an end in mind, or knowledge of change of variability. So knowing that something could happen in the future, there's a change that you want to affect, and you execute a physical thing right? Some form that is envisioned, which is brought into reality in a systematic way. And it's part of, it depends which Aristotle you read, right? But it is part of this approach that he outlines in a book called The Nicomachean Ethics about how an idea can become practiced, right? And then can be executed in a way that changes the course of things in a loop. And that is how sort of things evolve over time. But for our purposes, we're really going to focus. I didn't know I was going to have to use it, but I'm going to use the pointer. We're really going to focus on this up here, techne, the Greek idea that is sometimes translated as art or craft, but is actually about envisioning something that affects a change that is then put into the world in a material way. And technology is the study of and application of that idea. That's all technology is. So that's what we mean by technology, right? It's imagining something that affects a change in the world and executing against it, okay? Technology. I don't know that there was ever a rail car in Toledo, but I also think it's important to talk about what we mean by rapid change, because as a mathematician, since that was now introduced, right, we can talk about rates of change, right? And rates of change are actually different depending on where you are on a curve. So what can feel rapid can be different situationally. So certainly it is the case that I rode one of these. We took our 10-year-old to New Orleans. It was the best time of his life, right? So there are places where there are still streetcars and rail cars. But as we all know, you can see here, if you can read it, right? My last day, ride free. That many of these rail cars were put out of business by the Model T and by subsequent generations of automobiles. It will surprise no one to know that all of these things affect museums. Who wants to guess where the very first parking lot at an art museum was? Detroit. Yeah, that makes sense. When the Detroit Institute of Art relocated to its current location in 1927, they constructed their parking lot in 1926. William Valentiner was said to be sort of a brilliant visionary. He was a brilliant visionary. He was the most important decorative arts curator in the history of America. But he built the parking lot because his funders wanted there to be a parking lot, right? I mean, like this is absolutely why the DIA had the first one. But the rate of change, this is the point, the rate of change was about 30 years. Right? 1926, Model T, 1908, but you have germinal examples of that beforehand, right? So this is a multi-decade process to affect serious change. And we don't think about museums as living through a time of rapid change in this era, but consider that in 1890, almost no one had a telephone, almost no one had electricity, and almost no one owned a car. And by the time the DIA opens in 1926, a huge proportion of Americans did. It's a pretty incredible seismic shift to have lived through. And it's important to orient around that because while no one here can remember that, that's what's gonna happen over the next 10 years. And it might seem obvious that there should be parking lots at museums, but it wasn't. There was a first. And we'll come back to that later on in the presentation. And in fact, sort of the rate of tech change has become so fast that there's a term for it, technological obsolescence, right? And it's not just that we don't just have a term for it, we have a term for it which is actually studied by governmental and pseudo-governmental organizations like the National Bureau of Economic Research. So technological obsolescence refers to the replacement of technology which is still functioning by new technology which is better. Right? That's what technological obsolescence means. That can only exist in a world where technology is changing more rapidly than the life cycle of the previous generation of technology. So the idea that we all acknowledge there's such a thing as technological obsolescence is in itself a totally crazy notion. Right? It shows that the rate of change is accelerating. And there are a few different disciplines that sort of manifest this in ways that have sort of become part of the everyday discourse. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with Moore's Law, so this is an example. And since 2013 to 15, there's been some argument about whether this is precisely true. And we can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. But what Moore's law basically says is that the number of transistors on a chip will double in the same amount of time that the cost will have. Right? So exponential growth in computing power. And this will not always be true. It's hard to imagine a time at which the current hardware that we have will itself be obsolescent, right? But as a Roman historian, I can tell you two things definitively. These are my favorite lines, right? I know it's rich to hear from a 36-year-old that there are laws of history, but there are laws of history. They're always true. The first is that there's never been a generation in the history of the world that didn't think it knew everything. And the second is there's never been a generation in the history of the world that didn't think the generation before it knew absolutely nothing, right? So we live in the certainty of this moment, and I promise you that there is a future in which not only is Moore's law not true, but it's not true because chips have become obsolete, right? So wait for that future. You can call it wetware, you could call it whatever you want, but we will live in a different future. So the last definition that we need to orient around is okay, so we understand what technology is. We know what we're talking about when we talk about rapid change, but it's still a big topic, right? Technology has infiltrated museums in every single part of our operation. So for the purposes of this talk, in our remaining 30 minutes, we're going to talk about public engagement primarily, rather than back office functionality. And I don't want to suggest that e-commerce isn't a real part of our brand, right? But the best retailers in the world can't do retail. I don't know what makes museums think that they could do it. And MoMA hit a home run, but almost no other museum has. So we're not going to talk about front-facing digital outside of the way that we engage our audience in the actual experience of the museum and the artwork. Okay, so that's going to be our focus for the conversation. Sound good? Great. All right, now we're oriented. All right, so museum and technology have very brief history, very, very brief history. So Max Anderson, this polymathic director of a number of different institutions, wrote a great article on museums and technology, and like me as a Greek and Roman art historian, and has identified this sculpture as the earliest example of museum technology, and I really do believe he's right. So this is a Hellenistic bronze that was given to the formation of the Capitoline Museum, where it's still on display in Rome. And in 1471, this object went on display, and a gold star to anyone who can identify the technology that is embedded within this sculpture. Sure. So that is absolutely that is the technology that was used in its method of manufacture. But in terms of the way that we think about engaging the object in display, it is the most innocuous. Wait for it. It is this little brass spindle which you could grab and rotate the sculpture in 360 degrees, so you could see the sculpture from any angle. Because I guess walking around it wasn't enough. You had to walk with it as you rotated it for someone else. Very few museums would allow you to do this today, but this, I believe, is the first example of leveraging technology for display and interpretation of a work of art, 1471. To our point about rate of change, we're going to skip forward to the middle of the 19th century, to the 1850s in particular, to the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was then not called the Victoria and Albert Museum. It was called the Museum of Applied Arts, so about application, about techne, where we use a very old technology, almost as old as lost wax casting, plaster of Paris, but using plaster, to create the great cast court, right? So create all of these plaster casts of extraordinary and important architectural and art historical monuments. Here you can see Trajan's column being constructed around its sort of the brick pillar that serves as its center. Old technology bringing new experiences together, new juxtapositions, new opportunities to interpret works of art, abilities to see and study the real thing, but without having the real thing present. You'll see a trend that emerges is all that is old is new again. Right now you can 3D print things. Who knows? You might even be able to 3D print the Elgin marbles, right? This is a conversation which is being had. We've been having this conversation for 170 years, okay? So this is the first version of 3D printing. Now, there are other technologies that we all take for granted, which are way more quotidian, but hugely important to the museum experience. So we're talking about the visitor experience, the engagement with the work of art. We can forget that there was a time, given the age of museums, the first museum was actually the Kunstmuseum in Basel in the early 17th century. So we forget, not the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, but we sometimes forget that museums didn't always have plumbing. So the first museum to have plumbing, we think, was the Louvre, right? When the expansion was built and it was turned into a museum in the middle of the 19th century. So thank you, Louvre. You can now go to the bathroom at the Honolulu Museum of Art. And believe it or not, you would have thought that it would have been in the United States, given Thomas Edison. And it is true that the Smithsonian Museum 2 years after the British Museum instituted electric lighting, but the first electric lighting in a museum was in the British Museum. Also in the 19th century, Joseph Swan helped install it. So now we have electricity, and you can hear me amplified thanks to it. So plumbing and electricity were also hugely important, clearly, to the museum experience. It allowed museums to stay open later. It allowed people to stay in the galleries longer. Presumably, it made for a less smelly experience. As we fast forward, the first use of audio in interpretation happens in 1908 at the American Museum of Natural History when they do an exhibition on tuberculosis, which was hugely topical at the time because it was sweeping through the city. 750,000 people came to an exhibition on tuberculosis, and the gramophone was used to provide interpretation about tuberculosis in 1908. Around the same time, actually sort of in the 1915-ish range, film begins to be used as sort of a one-off in a number of different places around the world. And by 1920 and 30, film is actually pretty routinely being used, not in separate film galleries, but as part of interpretation for particular exhibitions, mostly in natural history and in science museums, much less so in art museums. In the 1950s, well, as an aside, I went to the Bishop Museum today, and there was a line out the door for the planetarium, which also would have been convenient if I didn't have to wait on the line for the planetarium to get my ticket. But it was still very, very nice to see that many people want to go to the planetarium. The first planetarium in the world was in 1923 in Germany. But we skip forward technologically in the art museum realm, and here you can see the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam introduced the first audio guide. And the reason I showed the picture of the inside of it is because it really helps when you have Philips just down the road in Amsterdam to help manufacture these things for you. But this emerges in 1952 and is very quickly adopted thereafter. Fast forward now another 40 years and you see the first instantiation of computer technology in museum interpretation. And we'll come to artificial intelligence in just a bit, but I will sort of, spoiler alert, I asked ChatGPT, one of these AI chatbots, to tell me about the micro gallery. And I'll tell you what the micro gallery is in a second. It said it opened at the National Gallery in DC in 1991. And as you can see from the press release, it's 1995. So you do have to be wary about what you're told on these things. But in the early 90s, American Express began funding what were called micro galleries. Does anyone here remember them, or did anyone here go to one? I see some nodding heads. So the first one was at the National Gallery in London, and the second one was at the National Gallery in DC. And the idea was that the entire collection of a museum would be searchable through a touchscreen that was run off of servers that were placed in a gallery. Obviously, this is much less sophisticated than Gallery 1 in Cleveland, which you'll see an image of in a later slide. But again, all that is old is new again. And fast forward to sort of the early 2000s, or the first decade of the 2000s, and then the second decade of the 2000s, and you end up with apps, right? Every museum needed to have an app. The return on investment on apps is not very good, generally speaking. But there was this moment, and this is sort of typical of a lot of the ways that museums think about technology, where museums thought to themselves, which is not to cast aspersions on any of the institutions that happen to be captured up here, right? It's just a general reflection on the museum space, that we sort of say, oh, we don't need that technology, right? The special thing about us is that you come into the space and we don't want to give people technology that distracts from the artwork. And then we realize people like the technology. We say, oh no, we missed the boat. We have to do something. And we sprint and we try to catch up. And then by the time we've caught up, the world is on to the next thing. Okay. So museums all built their apps, right? And at the same time, and then a decade later, museums thought, oh, but there are all sorts of interesting new functionalities that we can introduce to help interpretation in the gallery in a way that adds to, rather than detracts from, the experience. What we call in the space, or some of us call, heads-up experiences rather than heads-down experiences. And chief among those is augmented reality, where you can use a screen and you can point the camera at something and it can layer information that allows you to still interact with the work of art, albeit somewhat mediated by a screen, but get more deeper layered information about it. So that mostly brings us to today. Okay? So we started with a spindle and we ended with augmented reality, and we did that in 10 minutes or less. We're cooking. We're in good shape. All right. So that brings us today. So museums and technology today. So I told you the micro galleries were basically a foreshadowing of Gallery 1. This is what Gallery 1 looks like at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Just down the road from us, it's an exceptional thing. It's an absolutely great way to search the collection. If you haven't been, I recommend you go. Stop in Toledo on the way. But I want to talk to you a little bit about what this means. All right, so I want to pause on the technology for a second. I just want to take a 2-minute philosophical detour. Okay? So what this image means is it means that we care as a society about facilitating interaction to get information with a screen. And there are artists like Nam June Paik who anticipated this decades and decades and decades ago. I think it is common to hear people nowadays talk about humans interacting. In the 19th century, no one spoke about humans interacting. Humans spent time with each other. Humans spoke. Humans got together. Interactivity as a word actually emerges in the 19th century, but it really defines how humans interact with computers. And the fact that it has been onboarded into the language that we use to talk about how we interact with each other is an incredibly telling linguistic signal to where we are as a society. So we talk about interactivity. We talk about engagement, right? Where do these words come from? Who cares about these things, right? Who sets the language? And this is not conspiratorial, right? It's just, oh, here are some really successful companies that talk a lot about engagement. So engagement must be the way that we should talk about things. So are interactivity and engagement good? And to what end? If you interact with a screen, what are you actually doing? Well, as we know, you're creating data. And data is an indication of your preferences and your behaviors. And that's great because that means that we can meet you where you are. It means that we can find out what you want and we can tell you what we're doing that you might like to participate in. What's bad about that? Well, I think we know that it can create some echo chambers, but let's not pretend like museums aren't complicit in this. We think about our exhibition schedules now as a portfolio. We think about which shows will appeal to which people. We think about how to market different shows to different people as a field, right? Not talking about any particular institution here. Is that good? Is that the world that we want to live in? Don't we want to live in a world where every show is for anyone? As opposed to this show is for this person, and this show is for this person, and this show is for this person. Because when we talk about interactivity, and we talk about engagement, which are fundamentally about what technology has introduced into our lives, and therefore into the museum model, it's worth just checking ourselves to see, well, is that actually what we want? And is that actually the way that we want to talk about it? Because there are other ways of talking about it. And there are other clues to what the future might look like, even in technology today. And as with so many things, the answer lies with Taylor Swift. But we'll come back to that. So this interactivity, right, this approach to interactivity has obviously sort of most made itself manifest. I was talking with some lovely people about TikTok just a little while ago, has manifested itself in this sense in which we can create digital fora for communication, for human interaction. But of course, none of this is human interaction per se. It's human-computer-human interaction, right? So social media has become the way that humans interact, not just online, but in general. And I think as museums, one of the things that we are trying to do in the 21st century is we're trying to think about our communities and trying to think about how we build community. And what I want to build to over the next couple slides is how we can replace the idea of interactivity with the idea of community, and how technology can actually serve that purpose as we are about to live through over the next 10 years, the same sort of revolutionary change that I think we saw between 1890 and 1930 at an accelerated pace. And the answer, as I said, comes from Taylor Swift. The answer always comes from Taylor Swift. So I say that not sarcastically, because as many of you may know, Taylor Swift's most recent concert series, sparked not just fan ire, but antitrust interest, because Ticketmaster totally crashed completely crashed, altogether crashed when it opened up for sales of her concert. And the reason that it crashed is because people knew that if they could just buy tickets, they could resell them at a profit. So Ticketmaster developed a brand new platform to verify fandom. Are you in the Taylor Swift community or not? Because if you're in the community, you should get access first. And how you're in the community is something that can be defined with the artist. And Beyonce learned from Taylor, because if you're following what happened with Beyonce's world tour, you had to be a member of the Beehive, and she shut down signups for it, and didn't announce that she would shut down signups for it, so that they could market tickets first to people in the community. Okay? So you can see the beginning of a revolution against the idea that that everything should be available to everybody, but not necessarily in an unhealthy way, right? In a way that abets a sense of community and a sense of ownership and a sense of authenticity and engagement. Right? You could say, well, that sounds like they're putting up walls. Well, no, they're putting up walls against speculators, right? They're not putting up walls against passion. It's interesting, right? And this is using old technology. So now let's talk a little bit about the future. Talk a little about where we're going and what some of the seeds that are out there might suggest for the way that the museum model might change in really, really interesting ways as we try and build towards a greater sense of community. So there's a term out there, which I don't know that I'm going to have enough time to fully define, but I will in brief, called Web 3. So Web 3 is what we are about to live through over the next 10 years. A total change to the way that connectivity works and to the way that our lives are transcribed digitally. And all Web 3 means the backbone of the web is going to be replaced by an immutable distributed ledger called blockchain. You have probably read headlines about this through the guise of Bitcoin and NFTs and FTX imploding. And you may even think to yourself, this is bad. Nothing is bad. It's just a tool, right? And if there are nefarious users of a tool early on when it's misunderstood, that sounds like every new thing ever, right? But all blockchain is it's a tool that immutably transcribes transactions and ownership history in a decentralized way. And it turns out that is an incredibly powerful tool. And I'm going to give you all, even if you don't like get what that means, I'm going to give you all a visceral sense of what that means in just a few slides. But the easiest way to, without thinking about the technology, think about what Web3 means, is it means that we're going to go from an internet and a digital world where you can rent from big companies to a world where you own your digital identity. Because everything is going to be very clearly wrapped up in your personal identity across platforms. It's going to transform everything. And again, I'll tell you what that could look like in just a second in a way that's going to make you all be like, ooh, ah, I promise. So, but most, the way that you were introduced to Web3 probably was through this artwork that you can see up here. So this is an artwork called Everydays, and it was created by an artist named Mike Winkelmann, whose moniker is Beeple, and it made the news in March of 2021 because it sold for $69 million. It was the most expensive digital artwork ever sold, and it made him one of the top 5 most expensive living artists. Every one of these pixels represents a drawing that he made over 5,000 days, and this is an example of what one of them looks like. So when you think about it as 5,000 days of labor, right, I think you can think feels a little bit different, right? It's like buying 5,000 Picassos, but nonetheless, an extraordinary sum. And it was this thing called an NFT, a non-fungible token, right? And we all read about it, and I said, what is that? I don't even understand what that means. So all a non-fungible token means is it actually has nothing to do with artwork. All it is it is a title document, which is on the blockchain. When you go to a closing for a house and you have to go into the title agency and they have all this paperwork and you have to sign it, right? And you have to buy title insurance and all of that because you don't know how the bookkeeping was in the 19th century. That's a grossly inefficient way to make sure that people know who owns something, right? All an NFT is it's a digital title that forever will be associated with this thing. That's all it is, right? The artwork is not the NFT. It's actually a terrible use of the term. The NFT secures ownership to the artwork, okay? So this work of art sort of changes the way that we start thinking about NFTs, and obviously it creates a bubble, right? It creates hype. And Beeple himself has this great line. He says, look, are NFTs a bubble? Absolutely. But so was the internet bubble in 2000, and we still all use Google, right? So we have to be able to separate the fact that non-fungible tokens, right, were something that were really amplified in terms of price and have subsequently crashed in the utility of the technology. You probably also heard about these CryptoPunks and the Bored Ape Yacht Club. So these artworks, right, that were sold for millions of dollars each at the peak of the NFT bubble. And you look at these things and you might think to yourself, I can't understand why someone would pay so much for this. This is something I hear about all the time from people, right? Or to say but is this really art, Adam? Tell me what you think. Is this really great art? So I want you to imagine, right, your airline miles account. And I want you to imagine a conversation that you have inevitably had with someone about why the airline that you fly all the time is better than the airline they fly all the time, and about how mistaken that person is, that they like their airline more than yours, and then both acknowledging that actually, in point of fact, all airlines aren't that great, but you just feel like you have to fly that airline because that's where your Sky Miles account is. Does that resonate with anybody? Okay. So we don't make rational economic decisions all the time, right? We make decisions based on a sense of community, affiliation, and in this case, a little bit of sunk costs. I can't tell you, good for Hawaiian Airlines that I found an image with all the logos of the airlines where Hawaiian was first. I felt like that was very important for this audience. But imagine a world for a second, where you don't have a Hawaiian Airlines or a Delta Airlines account, and when you fly the other airline, you don't get miles. Imagine a world where you're you, and you amass miles no matter what. And further, imagine a world where you could sell your sky miles on the secondary market, and someone could buy your miles from you. That's the difference between Web 3 and Web 2. In Web 2, you rent miles from your airline, and you still feel affiliation. In Web 3, you choose your own destiny, and it becomes harder for the organization to develop authentic community and authentic connection with you. And you can see, so people ask, well, why CryptoPunks, right? Why Bored Ape Yacht Clubs? And the answer is because it provided a sense of community. You were in the group. It's like being in a social club. And the way that you articulated that you were in the social club is you made what you purchased your PFP, your profile picture, on Twitter. And that might seem silly to some of you, but it's no less silly than being committed to an airline because of invented SkyMile currency, right? We all make decisions that are a little bit strange, right, based on systems that we're accustomed to. I will tell you, because this is being recorded, this is a fake CryptoPunk, and this guy, Jack Morse, got raked across the coals for not actually being in the club, right, by making up something and making it seem like he was part of the CryptoPunk community. He wasn't part of the CryptoPunk community. And I think this is a pretty clever, so this is my ape. If you always wanted to be an ape but never had the means to for whatever godforsaken reason, you can use this one as your PFP as long as I own it. So this is a good one because it also articulates a really important point about this world, which is people sometimes say, well, you could just take a screenshot of it, right? I mean, you know, what's the point? It's not hanging on your wall. But if you don't have the title, you don't own it. It's like saying, well, I went on vacation and I found you in my house, right? I mean, it doesn't, you can still evict that person, right? They don't have the right to sell your house because they ended up in your house on vacation. So these works of art, and they are works of art, right? And whatever you think of their merits, right? They are works of art, but they are more than that. They code an interest in community. They code a sense of community to those who are also part of that community. And if that community is cool, then people want to buy into that community. That's what this is about. So, you know, it was really interesting to watch this in real time and to see people thinking about this in traditional art historical terms and not realizing what was happening. What was happening is that there was a way to articulate membership in a community through ownership of an asset, which I suppose happens in certain ways if you're a Porsche driver, right? There are places in the physical world where you see this show up, but it was now starting to happen in the digital world. And whatever you think of NFTs as a terminology, whatever you think of Web3, whatever you think of blockchain technology, make no mistake about it, the brands are in on it. The big brands are all in. And they're just not using the language anymore. They're calling it digital collectibles. They're calling it online community. But Starbucks, is anyone in here in the Odyssey Rewards program by chance? So Starbucks has rolled out its Odyssey beta to 30,000 users in which you can get digital collectibles from Starbucks for participating in certain activities. So if you go and you buy this particular Frappuccino, right, you will get a digital collectible. So you spend money at Starbucks and you get something from Starbucks, but as long as it's in limited supply and it comes with early access to other drinks in the future, there are a lot of different paths that you can walk through the Odyssey system, then you get a digital collectible. And guess what? This $200 digital collectible is now sort of retailing for $2,000 on the secondary market because how many people drink Starbucks? A lot more than 30,000. Really, really interesting, right? So Starbucks, and they're making money on every transaction of these digital collectibles, right, through other platforms. So it's a next generation rewards program where you own your own rewards and you can resell them, just like your Sky Miles. That's one example. Nike has just in the past week, has announced not their Air Force Ones, they're Our Force Ones. So they launched a platform called Dot Swoosh, where for $19.82, because in 1982 the Air Force Ones came out, for $19.82, you can purchase a box, a digital box. You don't know what your shoes are going to look like, your digital shoes, but you can purchase your digital box. Nike's going to make $6.5 million through the launch of Air Force Ones through Dot Swoosh. There were 4 designs that were, or a lot of designs that were submitted by the community. There were 4 designs that were chosen that won. You don't know which design you get until you open your box. So they've engaged their whole community in creating the first digital Air Force Ones. They've made $6.5 million doing it, and they've just engaged their community ever more deeply. It's like, okay, Adam, this is a lot, right? You're telling me that the world is changing. You're telling me that we can own everything. We don't have to rent anything anymore. And you're telling me that like all this stuff that I thought was toxic, right? Because that's all I hear about in the media, is actually at the same time becoming part of Nike and Starbucks' business model. That's interesting. What does that mean for museums? Well, let me give you an example of what it could look like. And I'm going to give you an example from the Toledo Museum of Art. So this is something that we're doing right now. Literally, as I arrived in Hawaii, Osinachi, a Nigerian artist, arrived in Toledo for what will be, I think, the first digital artist residency of its kind. Probably not the first digital artist residency. Good thing we have a contemporary curator or 2 in the audience. But we've been working with Osinachi to get him here for the past 4 months. I am happy to say on record that U.S. Customs and Immigration Services did not make it easy. But he is in Toledo, and we're very excited about that. And Osinachi makes these incredibly poignant and prescient works. And one of the things which is hard with digital artwork sometimes is to capture a sense of craft, right? Because the tools that digital artists are using are not necessarily tools that you can go across the street to the art school and participate in. He makes all of his work in Microsoft Word, which is part of the reason we wanted to work with him. I challenge anyone to try and make that a Microsoft Word. So there's a real sense of craft and sort of a real genius to what he does. But Osinachi will be spending time in Toledo, and he is an expert in using what are called generative algorithms. So he can produce an artwork, but then he can use a generative algorithm to create 5,000 unique examples of it, by changing color, changing gradation, changing various elements of the artwork. So Osinachi is going to spend time in Toledo. He's going to spend time engaging with our collection. He's going to spend time engaging with our community. And he is going to create digital artworks in editions of several thousand, okay? But each one will be unique, non-fungible. And we are going to give those artworks away for free to people who visit the museum. For free, no charge. Osinachi was just named one of the 100 most influential Africans. There are 1.2 billion people on that continent. He has to fly from Toledo to LA to talk in an Atlantic Council conference about democratization of Africa, the democratizing potential of technology in Africa. I mean, Osinachi is a big, big deal. We're very, very fortunate to have him. But this is something which is of value, theoretically, right? But we're just going to give it away for free. And we're going to give away as many works as he decides he's going to make in that first edition in a lottery system to people who visit the Toledo Museum of Art. And on June 3rd, we open an exhibition on Jacob Lawrence and an 8-month trip that he took to Nigeria in the 1960s. And he produced a whole series called the Nigeria series, and it's an exhibition on sort of African diasporic art in relation to all the exciting things that were happening in that early post-colonial period in Africa. So we'll create a second edition. Say the first edition has 2,500 digital artworks in it. If you have one of those 2,500, you'll be eligible for one of the 1,000 in the second edition, but only if you visit the Jacob Lawrence exhibition. But if you have the first one, you get into the exhibition for free. It's your exhibition ticket. So there's utility in it. There's value in it. Oh, and if you don't want it, you can sell it. You own it. It's yours. It's an artwork by Osinachi, right? So now all of a sudden the museum might be an income generator. Visiting the museum could be an income generating activity. Wow. So you can see how all of a sudden you can gamify museum visitation. You can incentivize different behaviors. You can engage different audiences because the museum visit has become a different thing, but you're rewarded more, marginally, incrementally, for each extra behavior you undertake. And you might say, well, yeah, Adam, that sounds gimmicky, right? I don't really know that that's going to engender repeat and ongoing visitation. Well, ask yourself if your kids and grandkids like video games. It's actually about the game dynamics, not about the technology, right? So I would submit that let's give it a try, and let's see how it goes. All right, yeah, so I spoke a lot about Web3. What about artificial intelligence? What about virtual reality? So as I wind down the talk, there are real applications of both of those. There are really exciting applications of both of those. But both of them have to be subordinated, I think, to our need to cultivate community. So the bigger question is, well, if we're in it to create community, because society is not doing a very good job of that, then what are the opportunities in each of these to create community? Virtual reality is, I think, fast developing on the graphical side of things, but I still am a little bit confused about what the use cases are to develop community. I think that there are some really interesting applications for museums around, say, virtual field trips. I think in a place like Hawaii, which is an archipelago, that's really interesting. It's probably not that easy for kids from the Big Island to come here on a field trip. So putting on a virtual reality headset's a way easier way of doing that. It's way easier in Northwest Ohio too, where it's hard to convince a principal to take a full day to drive from Defiance to the museum and miss all of that classroom time. So I think there are real applications for museums, but it's hard to see how they should be prioritized strategically if what we're talking about tonight is community. You can have good technology, but technology is just a tool. Does it serve the strategy? If we're talking about community, I'm not sure. Artificial intelligence is more interesting, so let's end where we started with Spinario. So ChatGPT is probably, of all of the AI chatbots out there, is probably the most popular one out there. So for those of you who can read, I asked ChatGPT to tell me about the Spinario at the Capitoline Museum in 50 words or less. I wanted it to simulate a label. So that's helpful, right? And it did it. And then I asked it if it could rotate it for me, since we now know that it could rotate. And it says, as an AI language model, I do not have the capability to physically manipulate objects like rotating a sculpture. Okay, so more limited in the in-gallery experience, obviously. But where it can get interesting from a community perspective is here. And I have no idea if this is good or bad, and we can talk about whether ChatGPT should be taken at face value anyway. But I asked it, can you tell me about the Spinario sculpture in 50 words or less in a way that would resonate in Toledo, Ohio? And then I asked it the same thing about Honolulu, Hawaii. And let's just compare the two to see. Toledo. The Spinario sculpture depicts a boy from ancient times who is sitting down and removing a thorn from his foot. It is a symbol of resilience and determination, showing that even in difficult situations, we can overcome challenges by facing them head on. Toledo talks a lot about its grit, right? It is not an economic city, or a city that has had the same fortunes economically over the past few decades. The sculpture can inspire us to persevere through adversity, much like the residents of Toledo, Ohio, a city known for its strong work ethic and industrial resilience. Honolulu. The Spinario sculpture, also known as the Boy with Thorn, is a bronze statue of a boy removing a thorn from his foot. It represents the importance of taking care of oneself and overcoming pain to achieve a better future. Just as the people of Honolulu strive to maintain balance and harmony with nature, Earth Day, the Spinario reminds us of the importance of personal care and perseverance in the face of adversity. I don't know where that resonates better or worse, but I can tell you that as a prompt, it's a pretty interesting one to at least engage your interpretation team with. So where do I end before opening it up to Q&A? And I will let you know that for the sake of it, it's a little gimmicky. We're going to ask ChatGPT all the questions you ask me, and we're going to see what it says, and I'll grade its answer in relation to my own. Technology is just a tool. It's a tool that museums have engaged with in fits and starts over their history, for better or for worse. I think there has been a trend in the way that we've engaged in creating better in-gallery experiences, but I think it's sort of culminated in buy-in to the cult of interactivity and engagement in a way that has actually lessened our ability to build community, which in some ways was the purpose of museums from the very beginning, at least executed at their best. I think that new technology will allow us to do that in new and better ways, and I'm pretty optimistic about the future. So thank you for your time, and we will open it up for 10 or 15 minutes of questions. So I've been told that people can more or less hear each other, but I'm going to repeat the question back into the mic so that the filmmaking can pick it up. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't see other hands go up, so I'll start. My name's Dennis Hermes, and I'm here from North Carolina. I wish I could say to come here for this lecture because you're brilliant and it's a wonderful lecture. I thank you very much for a tremendous number of ideas that were very advanced and I've not read anywhere in the literature. I do hope you write a book. You think that writing a book is the right thing to do to promulgate all of the intelligent ideas that you said? Or would you make a video?
Are you my uncle? I mean, this is lovely.
This video, will your lecture, this talk be online for me to have in North Carolina?
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't need to ask ChatGPT that. Yes, it will. So the question was, will the lecture be online? And yes, it will. Then where are you from, North Carolina?
Durham.
From Durham.
Actually, Hillsborough, historic Hillsborough.
Yeah.
And the National Museum is very active in many of the ways that I think you are. I'm sure you're aware of the Nasher, of
Very much so.
University.
Yep.
And in a way, you're, I think, simultaneous universities doing future work.
Yeah. Well, and I think the team there is thinking about acquisitions also.
So my simple question I will give you is, I grew up in the era of Marshall McLuhan and the global village.
Yep.
I'm sure you're aware of the concept, and I do believe that technology, as we are using it, is going toward the concept of both, as you say, community, I'll call it the global village, but I'll also say it's going toward the concept of mental telepathy, and that ultimately all of this has to do with knowing what other people are thinking. What do you think about that idea?
I don't. So let's see what ChatGPT says. What do you think? The future is for mental telepathy. This is all right. So as it's. Oh God. Maybe I'm not connected after all. All right.
I would rather that you answer.
I know. Well, that's my way of buying time, Dennis. So there was just.
Out and use ChatGPT.
Yeah. So there are two answers to that question. So one is there was a study that was just done with a very small sample in Japan, which some of you might have read about, where they were able to. The scientists were able to use. Were able to use brain scan data to recreate what the subjects were seeing in the MRI. So they were able to say, this is how the brain is responding to the visual stimulus, and they were able to back into understanding what the visual stimulus was from the way that the brain scan looked. So telepathy is actually not that far away. And there are obviously some ethical concerns that need to be worked through with all of this, including and especially that. With that said, I don't think that mental telepathy through technology is advisable just because it's executable. And I also, was going to seem like a weird way to answer the question, but there's a mid-20th century philosopher named Theodore Adorno who studies aesthetics, right? And he has this approach to aesthetics called negative aesthetics. He's a very complicated guy in general, and his prose is do not ask ChatGPT to summarize Theodore Adorno for you. Don't read it unless you're a real masochist. But he has this idea of basically the remainder. right? That like no matter what, no matter how perfect something is, it can't capture everything in its entirety, right? No matter how telepathic something is, it won't be perfectly telepathic. And then some scientists will go off to try and solve the next 10% of the variance, but it's still only, it's never not 100% of it. So there's always going to be something which is unexplained. There's always going to be something which is unanticipated. And that's the gap where humanity resides. So like if your question is technology going to become ever more pervasive in ways that are ever better to predict things? The answer is yes. But is it going to crowd out human experience? No. But we also need to be really thoughtful about how we create experiences and create a society that values those things. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So I find this idea of using technology to create community really interesting, and definitely where museums should be thinking about it. When we connect it to the blockchain, you lose me a little bit.
Yeah.
Only, well, for two reasons. One, because of an environmental reason that I find is complicated with the blockchain, regardless of whether technology is good or bad. That part of it, I think, is something we have to figure out.
Sure.
But the other one is that it seems you're creating community through ownership in a way that I am not sure is necessarily the only way we want to create community.
Yeah. So I'd say a couple things to that. So one is I actually think the environmental concerns are.
Talk to all of us rather than just one person?
Sure. I'd be delighted to. Yes. So I think the environmental concerns are mostly moot. I think the Bitcoin concerns are real, but the relative energy cost of many of these this is a technical conversation for over a drink, but I think not only are things relatively moot, but notwithstanding a lot of the way that Bitcoin is mined in this country, in other countries, they are, a lot of these server farms are run off of renewable energy. So it's actually, like anything in the climate change conversation, it's a supply chain of energy generation question rather than an energy intensivity conversation. And it's not to say that there's not really sort of like terrible environmental consequences of some of the blockchain-based technologies, but as a rule, not only are most of these things solved, but they're going to be solved where they aren't, even and including among Bitcoin. So, but to the second point, which is ownership the only way, or even an advisable way? I'd say it's certainly not the only way, but I do think it's an advisable way, because I think people value things differently when they own them. And I think that I can imagine other societies where that's not true, but that's not the society we live in. And where I think there's some really interesting opportunity is in totally rethinking the museum membership model. I think museums have already started thinking about that a little bit, right? Who here has a reciprocal membership that gets you in other places? But we could embed more utility in museum memberships, and we could create memberships that have a greater degree of value. And in a capitalist society, value is about what the exchange value of the thing is. So if there's value in it, and it accrues value, and you can transact it, I think it will actually create greater affiliation. I think that if we do our job well with Osinachi, there will be a secondary market value that is high, and people still won't sell. So ownership doesn't mean that you have to sell. It just means that you own it, and you can ascribe a worth to it, which is tangible, more tangible. So it doesn't mean there aren't other ways of going, but it's not a way of going that we've gone. So let's try it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thanks. It's good talk. I heard one of your guys at a conference, one of your team members at a conference.
Gary.
Years ago, yeah. And you explained some things very well that maybe he didn't. Anyway, but And I have to say, I really appreciated you leading with Matt Sanderson, who's a very old friend, and I think one of the underappreciated people in our field. I think that the work that he did on membership models at Dallas
Yeah.
is exactly what you're talking about. But actually, my question is about is similarly about community and the other ways that we build it. I am curious to know how you see us expanding knowledge creation to include the kinds of information that we collected from community in the big Web 2, moment, but haven't been able to grapple with or incorporate. Because I think it is showing our audience members, our community, that we value their knowledge and that they are part of the network of information and knowledge that we have fed to our communities to now, that we have some real opportunity in Web3.
Yes, total. So
Excuse me, I'm sure she had a good question. For those of us who don't
I'm
hear
good,
well,
yeah.
could you let us know what it was?
I'm going to repeat it. Yeah. So there was a lot in there. So first, she complimented Max Anderson, who is a longtime director, who I'm going to see on Tuesday. I don't know your name, but I will. And then she asked about the possibilities to take advantage of community knowledge in museum discourse and museum interpretation and storytelling, including and especially knowledge which has already been shared in the current version of the internet. Fair?
Yeah, although I think that the current version of the internet is the smallest part of what real
What?
knowledge.
But you teed it up in terms of Web 2, right? I was going to broaden it. Yeah. So I am in some ways obviously trying to think ahead, right? And in some ways it's possible that I'm the last dinosaur. So I care deeply about community engagement, but I care deeply about community co-creation. And I think that sometimes the conversation can get a little ahead of itself because museums do actually have some value to bring to the table. So it's actually about synchronizing types of knowledge that we don't have with the knowledge we do have, depending on the story we're trying to tell in that moment. And so there will be moments where the community should drive the conversation. There will be moments when the museum should drive the conversation. And there will be a lot more moments that are in some degree of equilibrium, right, between those extremes. And I think it needs to be measured on a case-by-case basis rather than on some absolute basis of what good community engagement looks like. So I don't have a really great answer for you about what it looks like. I don't think there's a formula that works for every project or every institution. But I do think that one of the commitments that we have to make as a field is to make sure that the relevant stakeholders are engaged in co-creation where and as appropriate. And I certainly think technology has a role to play in that, because for institutions like this one or ours that sit in a place but are trying to do something global, then our stakeholders aren't always here. And technology is the asynchronous way for us to be able to engage those stakeholders in telling their story. Yeah.
Does your stakeholder community include any millennials or Gen Z people? There's nobody in this room who looks Gen Z except me.
We got someone in the back, we have someone in the middle.
One.
2, 3, 4. No, I'm a millennial.
Oh, okay, well.
So more and more, and some of that is demographics, right? Look, so there are two answers to that question. So one is, I'm not sure you've ever been in a museum theater, not you, generic you, has ever been in a theater and thought it looked sufficiently young, right? So I also think there are opportunities for institutions. Institutions also engage people at certain times, and that's okay too. Being everything to everyone is a pathway to being nothing for no one. But obviously, I think that there are huge opportunities for engaging a global community of Gen Zers and millennials. But I think technology, thoughtfully deployed, is going to be a huge part of doing so. And I think that expectations in that community around things like ownership are going to be a pathway to doing just that, right? Being part of a group, being part of a community is hugely important to those younger generations. So membership at a museum currently doesn't feel like you're part of the community. It feels transactional. So when you can bake in some of these dimensions of ownership, I think we'll be more successful. I think it's going to require a lot of experimentation, and I think we might have to change the model a little bit. But so there are 2 points there. One is there's the digital engagement, which creates community affiliation and creates a greater likelihood to engage with the museum and the collection over the medium term. But I also think it will be a shame for museums to totally change what it is they're about, because I think an unmediated interaction with a work of art in a world that is very stressful and full of technology outside of the museum space warrants a space that cuts against that. And if that means that tomorrow the galleries aren't teeming with 23-year-olds, I think that's okay, as long as there's a strategy over a number of years to engage more authentically. So it's not either or, it's both and. Yeah. And if you try and make, we'll do the Van Gogh experience, right, after the Hung Lu exhibition, and we can fill this place with young people, but then they'll go away. And that's how museums treat exhibitions. It's back, your question is actually predicated on the market segmentation of an Amazon or a Netflix, and actually to build a community that looks demographically, including age, like anyone, it's going to be a way slower build, and tech is 100% part of that. Yeah. All right, so I think last question. There's so much enthusiasm behind that hand. I hate to skip over you. So how about this? Why don't you ask them, because maybe it's the same question, right? So we'll go with you first, then you, and then we'll wrap it up. Yep.
So when I think about community, I often think about some participation on the part of many people in the community, not just consumption or ownership.
Totally.
Do you see, how do you see participation from the public in this future?
So how do you see participation from the public as part of community? And question number 2?
It's not really.
That's okay.
So, it took me a moment. In the field of history of technology,
yeah,
academics have written a lot and continue to about change. They focus on one technology and change over time. But there is a subculture that focuses on not just one technology in your daily life, but all your technologies in your daily life. And spends its time thinking about the technologies that don't change, the ones that persist, either in the same use or in a revised use over many years. If you look at your life, you'll see that there are things you do, things you use that have been that way for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. What do you think of the technologies that will or should persist in the museum in one form or another?
So the question there is, what do you think about technologies that will or should persist in museums in one way or another? So those 2 questions are more related than you think they are. And even if they weren't, I was going to say that anyway to wind us down. So I actually believe that the best outcome for museums over the next 50 years is to create an experience where every gallery in every museum looks like the community it serves, regardless of the work of art on display, regardless of the interpretive paradigm being used. That anything we do is for anyone. That's the type of world I want to live in. Not a world where this gallery is full of this type of person, the Gen Zers are over here, and the boomers are over here. That's not a world I want to live in, right? So I think the technologies that abet that are the ones we've always used. Good display, good interpretation. Maybe the labels will be digital, so we don't have to reprint them, but basically good display, good interpretation, objects that get space so that they can be appreciated, and an environment that lets you decompress from the world around you. Museums were not engineered to be mental wellness benefits, but they happen to be, right? And it's something that society acutely needs. But how you get people to that point, how you construct that marketing funnel, will leverage technology, it will leverage community outreach, it will leverage art making, and to your question about participation will look different at different layers of that funnel. At some points, ownership will be sufficient to convert someone at a certain percentage to the next level of engagement, and there will be multiple paths through the funnel. But at some point, volunteerism, a really old school means of engagement, but the single best predictor of a planned gift to a museum, is going to remain an incredibly important part of how you deepen engagement. So I can't speak for every institution, but participation in volunteering, in taking a class, right, in joining a gallery group is going to be a huge part of how you build a sense of community. But I do think that participation is something that comes later on in the visitor journey. I think asking people to participate right away is not an effective way to engage people. You need to develop a relationship before participation. We've done outreach. We've done a lot. We've done outreach. We've done art schools and art classes and art making. Ownership is something we haven't tried. It doesn't mean it's the only thing we haven't tried, but it's something we haven't tried. And I would be surprised if it didn't result in greater participation. All right.
It's not a follow-up. I just wanted to say, I wanted to ask a question about equity and where that fits in with this future you're predicting.
So I'm pretty sure that she's going to pull me off in a second, but I think equity is a top of mind concern, but and the digital divide is real. But smartphone penetration in this country is incredibly high and getting higher. And 5G provides access to high computing speeds that didn't exist even a few years ago. And equity is real. It's something we think about every day. It's also something that in the tech arena is going to become a diminishing problem, not an increasing problem. We just need to think about how we provide access. So I can tell you when it comes to our work with Osinachi, there will be no conversation of wallets, right? Of crypto wallets, right? There's going to be no conversation of setting up a MetaMask account, right? We are going to be able to provide the NFTs directly to people, even if they don't have a computer at home. So you can work around it, but you have to be thoughtful in the design. All right, I think I'm done. Thank you, everybody.
Great job.
Thanks. You want to say anything?
I just want to thank everybody so much for coming and thank Adam so much for sharing with us and talking with us. And I hope that you all really enjoyed that. We really appreciate you coming out this evening and hope to see you again soon.